I was a big deal in those days, at least as much of a big deal as I could be in high school. I was the star of my school's football team, my girlfriend was the hottest girl in class, and I was driving a Ford Mustang Mach 1, 1969. One of the finest cars in the world, and it was all mine thanks to a scout checking me out at one of our football games, big talks of a scholarship with my name on it. I didn't understand how much potential I had until my dad turned to me after talking to the scout with this excited glint in his eyes. That week, a black muscle car was parked in our driveway. My dad said it was mine. Times were different in the 70s. I got my license when I was 16. I knew some kids who got theirs when they were 15. Anyway, I was cruising through town all day that day with my father. One of my happiest memories. If anyone in the school didn't know my name by then, they all did when they heard the roar of that Mustang's engine when I arrived. Yeah, I was a bit of a douche in high school, but those who knew me also knew I was one of the nicest guys. My friend, Clint, said it was because I was very slow at times, which a lot of people found cute. I didn't care what they thought, as long as they knew I wasn't some thug, despite my looks. I enjoyed having friends. Anyway, I tell you all of this because something big was going to happen. The entire class, about 50 17-year-old teenagers, were about to go on a camping trip. Tall trees, mountains, warm fields baking in the sun. Situated near a river was a large camp, with log cabins, a few fire pits, and even an outdoor cafeteria under a thatch roof. Not to mention the activities they had set up, even a classic obstacle course. Of course, it was a big deal. Even if we were almost technically adults, we still had that childish energy in us. We were thinking about swimming in the river, competitive camp games like tug-of-war, sneaking off after lights out with our girlfriends, and of course, impressing anyone somehow during that trip. Whether it was winning a foot race, a pull-up contest, or scoring in the bushes. We talked about all of this after the school announcement in the boys' locker room. "Nick, are you driving down there in the Mustang?" Clint asked me. "Of course," I said. "Sally and I are going together." "So, mind if I hitch a ride with you guys?" Clint asked in a hushed tone, looking around at the other guys. "Forget it, there's no room." "But you have 4 seats," Clint yelled. Everyone laughed. "Yeah, that's where our things go," I told him. "Put it in the trunk." I put my hand on top of his head and shook him around a little. "Then where would I put the beers?" I told him. There were a few cheers when the guys heard this. Speaking of which, I am collecting cash so my big bro can get a beer. Anyone interested in getting on this, pay up. The more you give, the better the selection. Some paid up there, and some paid later. Some made orders and put a little extra in. You have to understand that our entertainment was very limited compared to today. The movies had it right, alcohol and sex were on our minds, very little else, truth be told. We were very organized when it came to setting up a party, at least most of the time. "Well, if you're bringing beers, then I guess I can ride the bus for a few hours," Clint said, suddenly very amiable. "Still. Next time, pal." Asterisk. I parked outside Clint's house and angrily set the handbrake in place. I watched him practically skip out of the house with a pack on his back. After putting his things in the back seat, Clint opened the passenger door and hopped into the Mustang. "Hit it, lover boy," he said. "Shut the hell up." I snapped. All he could do was laugh as we set off. "Hey, I'm sorry Sally got sick," Clint said, twisting the cap off a soda bottle. He was very careful with it after I glared at him. "Yeah, me too," I muttered. We listened to the radio in silence. I stopped at the gas station before heading to school. I needed to fill up the tank, and a jerry can always good to have a little extra for long trips. Clint kept slapping his legs to the tune, like some anxious drummer who really needed to jam. He got really energetic when he had sugar. I was glad when we got out to confirm we were present and ready to follow. A few teachers weren't happy with me driving to camp, but when you have no real black marks on your record, your parents' permission, and the football coach heading the field trip, they really couldn't do anything. I was still more than a little frustrated. As we drove, I decided to break the silence by venting what was going through my head. Sally didn't seem sick when I talked with her the day before. I heard through the grapevine that her ex was also staying behind. Sally had a track record for choosing bad guys and cheating. She was one of those follow-your-heart type girls. I was prepared to give the trip a skip on that alone, but with a trunk full of alcohol that others paid for, I just felt obligated to go. My father also said something that bothered me. "Stand by her as long as she stands by you," he began. "And when you have nobody to stand by your values. No matter how much it hurts." I'd have happily taken lies and unfounded guarantees over some be the bigger man wisdom. "Do you think she would cheat on you?" Clint asked as I told him this. "I don't know. I'm not special," I said. "I'm not her first. I'm not Dash." "Ah, don't start with that bull," Clint said, easing back into his seat. He really knew how to make himself comfortable. "If she screws up what she has with you, she's an idiot. You'd be better off without her, but she sure as hell wouldn't be better off without you. I'd still be the idiot who trusted her." "PFF, you've always been an idiot, Mr. Football Scholarship," Clint said. I thumped the side of his arm. "No offense. We all have our strengths. Anyway, your dad is right. You don't know if she is gonna do anything, so try not to think about it. Whatever. And they might not look it, but those other girls are something else," Clint said. "Her loss is another's gain." "What girls?" Clint pointed to the school bus in front of us. The back window wasn't the cleanest, but I could see a group of girls at the back waving at us. Clint leaned forward and turned up the music as loud as it could get. The girls hooped and raised their arms, but then suddenly faced forwards before sitting down in their seats. "Bet you that was Miss Weaver that shouted at them," Clint said, turning the music down. "Crazy bitch should have been left behind." I spent the rest of the trip watching Clint and one girl at the back of the bus mime an entire conversation, him saying things that made me laugh. If she could have heard him, she would have kicked his ass. We took a narrow, wavy road into camp. It wasn't too bad for the Mustang, but the bus struggled. At least somebody had thought ahead and cut back branches. I could see piles along the road and the flat stumps sticking out the trunks they had left behind. When we reached the spot, I parked the Mustang beside the bus. Clint and I grabbed our bags and joined the roll call. We were divided into different cabins. 2 girl cabins, 3 boy cabins. There certainly wasn't a shortage either, but I guess only some of them were prepared for us. After stowing our things, we were given a rundown of camp activities and the schedule they had set out for us. Looking back, I realize now that the whole camp thing was just to make the school look good, a photo opportunity to show off to parents and get more enrollments. I wouldn't have cared even if they made it obvious. Looking at that schedule, I just noted the free time they gave us. Morning, midday, and evening, except for the 5th day, which was a stargazing astronomy lesson, blah. I used the first free slow to talk with the guys before we went to our assigned cabins. The plan was simple. Get the booze in the evening, conceal it in our bags, and then hide it in the cabin. There were only a few teachers and a couple of hired instructors. There weren't any room checks, nothing. These were lenient adults who wanted to enjoy their time there as much as we did. I wouldn't have been surprised if Coach Sykes brought his own booze. 1 or 2 from every cabin, Clint said. Bring empty bags. We can't all go to the Mustang, people will definitely notice. What time? Somebody asked. Late, after midnight, I said. We gotta make sure the teachers are asleep, so midnight is a good time. With the plan set, I was part of the 6 guys that would hike back up the bus and Mustang. I wasn't about to lend someone the keys to my car just so they could open the trunk. Besides, seeing as it was in my car, I would get in trouble anyway if things went to hell. Asterisk. Stop crowding the window, I told the guys in my cabin. We have to keep a lookout, Nick, one said. If you're caught, we ain't getting out a drink the rest of the week. Shut up, I said, sliding the window shut. I will get the damn beer. Tensions were high. The first 2 nights of our stay were screwed. One of the girls, that first night, swore she saw something in the woods and screamed, which set the teachers off thinking there were wild animals. Big deal, right? It's the forest, there's bound to be a few animals. A fact that didn't keep her from screaming her head off. It was a big joke the next day, but she wasn't laughing. The night after that was screwed thanks to a pair of lovebirds who crossed by right in front of one of the teachers' cabins. Big mistake. For that one, Coach Sykes kicked in every door to the guys' cabins and lectured us on late-night walks in the forest. When I regrouped with the others outside the cabin, we walked deep into the forest before rounding out towards the car. We kept the distant lights of the camp in sight, just in case we lost our way. We were also far enough that we could talk on our walk. Got some news, guys, Clint said, grabbing one guy by the back of the neck, one of the lovebirds from the night before. Our buddy here got caught last night, Dash. Tell us something we don't know, one guy interrupted. Shut up, he got caught last night with his girl going for a stroll. What he failed to mention was that he wasn't going someplace with his girl. Oh, no. They were, in fact, returning from their little rendezvous, Clint said, followed by his best French laugh. Bullshit, did he tell you that? No, this little bit of information came from Abigail who, get this, thanked him for a wonderful night, right outside the girls' cabin this morning. You heard? The lovebirds said. 3 cheers for Stanley and Abigail tomorrow, Clint continued, patting Stanley's shoulder. For now, pay this stupid bastard back for almost costing us a great booze heist. Clint smacked the back of Stanley's head, followed by the rest of us who had a few soft hits in. With that matter settled, we cracked jokes and continued our climb up the hill. We soon found the familiar path that we took down to camp and stuck to that. It was slow going. You'd be surprised how dark it can get, and we weren't about to use flashlights. Luckily for us, the bus was easy to spot in the dark, so we stumbled over to it and approached the trunk of the Mustang. After unlocking the trunk, we started to pack our bags with the cans of beer. Why cans? One guy asked. Bottles make noise, I told him. Although I have a brandy bottle here for Max, who felt like being a little extra. Which cabin is Max in? Mine, hand it here, another said, taking it. Fucking brandy. Fucking brandy, we all repeated. Max always has to be special, huh? Well, he better share. We're not going to be able to take everything, Clint said. That's fine, I said. We missed the first 2 nights, so it works out. I closed the trunk and locked it. We tightened our packs and prepared ourselves for the walk back. It was going to be a lot harder. Liquid tended to slosh about, making balance tough. It would take even longer. Unfortunately, going slow was no longer an option. Near the path we took, we saw a flashlight. It bobbed with the person's movement, and for a moment we just stared at it, then the light turned to us. Silently, we all turned to the forest and ran, knowing that if we said anything, our voice might be recognized. We had to leap over a short fence the vehicles were parked in front of. I could tell that a few of us had tripped over it. I heard glass break and another utterance of fucking brandy before we took the tumble down. Loose leaves, tall grass, and twigs. I could tell we had entered the deeper forest when the grass thinned out and all I heard was the crunch of twigs and leaves. I didn't run for more than 10 seconds before I noticed how quiet it got. I'd focused on making distance. Running with that weight on my back didn't faze me much. I had been running with weights like that as part of my exercise routine. You need strong legs to play football. I started to veer to my left, knowing I needed to head back to the cabin. I was about to say the same to the others when I realized why it was so quiet. I didn't hear any other footsteps. The others must have separated, which was a smart move. It just seemed that I was the only one that ran so far before deciding to turn back to the cabin. I cursed when I realized that whoever was checking out the parking lot could go back to the cabins and make sure everyone was accounted for. If the others made it there before me, great, but how would they explain me and my pack missing? I kept running. A few minutes later, I saw the distant light of the camp. I slowed down to catch my breath and began creeping back to my cabin. If I moved too fast, someone might notice. Basic sneaking in the dark rules that everyone should know, which is why you never scan the darkness, you linger in spots to notice the small changes. Before I got close, I heard something. A repetitive beating sound, growing louder. A steady series of thumps and footfalls, then all I heard was a growl as something collided with my side, knocking the window out of me. I could barely catch my breath before I felt this pressure on my back and a viscous pulling. All I heard was snarling, and that weight was making it difficult to get air back into my lungs. I heard fabric rip as my pack was torn open. I heard claws on the cans, but then something crunched. I felt something wet hit the back of my head, and then I heard the hiss of the beer spraying out of the can. The pressure lifted for a moment, but the snarling remained. It got closer to my ear. I could feel the breath hit the back of my neck. I could hear it sniffing and growling soon after, just as it did before it bit into one of the beer cans. Light. A flashlight beam crossed through the trees, hitting me before going somewhere else. The pressure lifted off my body and I heard something running. I rolled over quickly to see something moving between the trees. It was massive. A dog-like creature that bounded from tree to tree before sprinting off into the darkness. I stayed still in the shadow of the tree. I heard the footsteps of someone. Whoever they were, they stopped just before my tree. The flashlight scanned back and forth over the forest before they turned around and walked back to camp. I steadied my breathing again when I thought they were out of earshot. The feeling of panic took a lot longer to settle. When I thought it was safe, I got everything together and made my way to the cabin. I took my time not just to be careful, but because I kept looking back. I reached up and knocked on the window. It slid open. Hands stretched out to take the pack, and then they helped me inside the cabin. In the dark, I got plenty of pats on the back. I was the last one, but no alarms were raised. Mission successful. What happened to your pack? Someone asked. Did you catch it on something? Looks like he already started. 2 cans are missing, another said. The mood was too good and I was too disoriented to tell them anything. I decided not to say anything, but I was grateful it was dark. I didn't want them to see my face. Asterisk. That night was a mini party, as was the 4th night of our camping trip. Some booze slipped into one of the girls' cabins, but I wasn't complaining. I just tried to relax as best as I could after that. Being the camp hero, I had plenty of beer to help with that, but otherwise, we were all fairly calm and quiet. On the 5th day, Clint shouldered me. One of the cabins has gone dry, he said. Max has won. I guess he needed the stronger stuff to keep him from overdoing it. Too bad, I said. I'm not going to get more. Screw Max. Yeah, my thoughts exactly, Clint nodded. Besides, it's the last night. No chance of slipping past the teachers tonight, especially Coach Sykes. What do you mean? Stargazing tonight, Clint said. Remember? We're going for a night hike to the clearing to get a good look. Maybe I can smuggle some of my dash. I stopped listening to him. I was busy thinking up excuses. Asterisk. The best excuse I could come up with was food poisoning. Not the blow chunks into the toilet, but the painful, stomach-imploding kind that made it difficult to go on hikes in the dark. Coach Sykes immediately saw it as his best football player needing some rest and recovery, so gave me a few pills and told me to hit the sack. Miss Weaver, however, would stay behind and keep an eye on things. She didn't want to leave one student behind in the camp while everyone went off on the hike. I think she was going to stay behind anyway. She was a little too old for it all as well. I didn't care. I just holed up in my cabin and breathed a sigh of relief. I saw her make the rounds, walking mostly between the cafeteria and the female teacher's cabin. I see her stop at some point to look out towards the river and the mountain behind it, smoking a cigarette. I couldn't really see her figure, but I could see the glow of the cigarette tip now and then. I joined her with my relaxation ritual. A few cans of beer were close by. I thought about the trip back home. Clint would be riding shotgun, I knew that much, but I wondered if the extra fuel from the jerrycan would be enough. I tried recalling a gas station along the way. I crushed a beer can into a flat disc and added it to the rest. We would get rid of all of them in one shot. Couldn't leave any easy-to-spot cans lying around. With these mundane thoughts circling my mind, I decided that I was preoccupied, as well as liquored up, enough. It was time to get some sleep. I went to bed and waited for sleep to take me. I then heard the footsteps of someone walking outside. Looking up to glance through the gap in the curtains, I saw the familiar glow of a cigarette. I was about to lower my head when the shape shifted and a second glow appeared. To fiery sparks in the darkness that weaved from side to side. I didn't quite understand what I was looking at. That's when the figure left the darkness, so painfully slow. Creeping, not too different from the way I did when I approached the cabin after grabbing the booze. As the cool light of the night hit the body, the shape confused me more. At first, I saw an arm, but it was dark and misshapen. The fingers weren't that long, the legs themselves appeared crouched, yet the figure was tall. As it stepped fully into view, I saw that the misshapen parts of its body were merely clumps of hair that seemed to stand among its already hairy form. The fingers weren't long for its size, but its claws made up for it. The eyes lost their red tinge, becoming black beads that caught the light, but even the darkness seemed to dim that glint. It was a monster, a wolf-like creature standing on its back legs, its body an ugly, demonic mix between man and dog. Yet, its face was that of a hound with white teeth, gnarled, as I could see a few poking out from beneath its black lips. As it approached, it must have seen me. It must have seen me see it. Why else did it walk so slowly? Yet, why did its eyes follow mine? Maybe it knew I saw it and just didn't care. It knew that there wouldn't be any interruptions this time. It knew I was alone. If it could smile cruelly, I felt it did just before it dropped to all fours and ran towards the cabin. I was helpless. Despite my size, despite my strength, I couldn't do anything. I saw the glass shatter as if it weren't really there. A window to me, a bothersome cobweb to it. Darkness filled my vision, and in that darkness, its eyes became like fire once again. I saw teeth, I felt claws dig into my skin. I remember grabbing a bed frame. I felt teeth sink into my left leg. It hurt, but I felt true pain when the teeth reached my bone and I could feel the crunch. The grating of bone on bone. I was screaming all the time, but I knew that help wouldn't reach me in that second. The creature tried to pull me out the window. It got my leg hung over the window. It started to tug at my leg. I heard nothing but ringing and my heart pounding. I dropped to the floor of the cabin, but I didn't feel it. I stared at the broken window and the wet blood gleaming on the windowsill. I raised my eyes to look at the sky and then I passed out. Asterisk. I woke up in an ambulance, I think. The sun was up. A beam of light gleamed through the windshield and straight into my eyes. With the light in my eyes, everything looked dark, highlighted with gold. "He's awake," a guy behind me said. "Thank God," the driver said. "I will let Aurora know." "Hey, kid, how are you feeling?" the man behind me asked. Before I could answer, he continued speaking. "If you feel a little weird right now, that's just the drugs taking effect. If you want to rest, you can. We will dash." I didn't have much choice. I could feel my eyes roll back and then my head drop. I was out again. Asterisk. The next time I woke up was 2 days later, post-surgery. I woke up with family around me. There is a certain kind of sadness that still tears me up inside when people look at me. Yet, it doesn't hurt as much as the expressions my family wore as they sat by my hospital bed. My father especially. My leg had been amputated, at least, partially. A lot of it was already missing, according to my family. The doctor explained the rest to me alone. I will spare you gory details, but tried to save as much as they could in surgery, but it wasn't going to happen. Looking down at my left leg was surreal. I just couldn't believe it. Maybe my mind was just preoccupied with something else. I received flowers from Sally, but she never showed up. Turned out my bad feelings about her were founded. She just felt guilty enough to make an empty gesture. When Clint told me that little bit of news, it was like a drop in the ocean. I told him to forget it when he suggested a little revenge. I just didn't care. And sure, losing my leg was life-changing. I didn't get my football scholarship gone, but the university I was speaking to did give us a sort of half-scholarship thing. It meant I needed better grades, and my parents had to pay more than they would, but still less than the full price. I will never know what I could have become. What I am now is nothing more than a glorified manager at a car dealership. I spend most of my days at a desk, just getting on with life. And it's not bad, but like said, I get those looks. And those who knew me can't help but look a certain way when they see me. Even as I look at my leg now, my thoughts aren't filled with what could have been, even though there is plenty of that at times. All I think about is that creature. That man-dog thing. It changed everything inside my head. It ruined my life, the life I could have, but it also broke something inside me. It took something inside of me. Because I hear it. I hear it every time I am close to falling asleep. My heart aches with fear. I feel powerless all over again. I know it isn't in my city, let alone outside my window. But I still check, every single night. As you can guess, this isn't my story. It was told to me through sips of whiskey and packed cigars. I can't vouch for the exact details, but I'll try to tell the story as it was told to me. My uncle grew up in the 60s and 70s in a house full of kids and with a friend group consisting of stoners and underage drinkers. He was close with almost all of them except for a guy we'll call Dan. My uncle and Dan never got along well. Apparently, Dan had dated my aunt and broken her heart. One day, the group went camping in the old woods across town. The trek was arduous. There were lots of fallen trees, low-hanging branches to duck under, and a narrow river they needed to find a way around. My uncle was the one leading them to their campsite, an out-of-place clearing that almost looked purposeful. When retelling this story, he said they had been complaining all the way there but became practically awestruck at the sight. The clearing was more of a meadow. Beautiful flowers and tall, luscious trees formed a large ring around them as they unloaded their packs. It took them until dusk to fully set up their camp for the next 3 days. The group huddled around a campfire as night fell, telling stories and reminiscing about childhood long into the night. Someone had snuck some whiskey into their pack and was passing it around to everyone. There was when my uncle heard the tale about a cave nearby. The story talks about a group of kids who went hiking in the mountains only for one of them to return. Shell-shocked and traumatized, the kid was never able to tell the police exactly where to find his 2 friends. A hush fell over the group, and unease spread. Something about that story unsettled even my uncle, a known skeptic. The group called an early night and turned in for restless sleep. My uncle had a dream that night. In his dream, he was the young child from the story. He was trekking up a steep incline, followed by 2 of his friends, Susan and Fred. It had just rained, and the mud was slippery under their boots. He looked back at the 2 following his lead and said something inaudible as a flash of lightning crashed nearby. Soon, booming thunder shook the very ground they walked on. The 3 marched onward as dark clouds loomed overhead, threatening to unleash a mighty downpour. After what felt like hours of walking in place, the earth leveled out as they reached a small clearing. The 3 children stood facing the mouth of a cave, and when they peeked inside, a sharp drop-off beckoned them closer. Susan grabbed my uncle by the arm, but her voice was drowned as another flash of lightning was followed by more roaring thunder. The darkness urged my uncle ever closer. Arm-like tendrils reached for him out of the darkness as he took another step toward the cliff edge. He could hear whispers from the pit. The voices yearned incessantly for a sacrifice. My uncle awoke from his nightmare with sweat rolling down his back and labored breathing. The sun had yet to rise, and all that was heard was the gentle snoring from his friends in the neighboring tents. Deciding he needed a breather, my uncle crawled out of his tent and into the warm night air, admiring the stars that were clearer and brighter than he had ever seen, like tiny, faraway flashlights in the sky. "Beautiful, aren't they?" said a soft voice beside him, snapping him from his thoughts as he turned to face Susan. "I've never seen the stars this bright." "Yeah, they're really something else." He smiled at Susan. "What did you think of that story?" she said abruptly, turning to my uncle with a curious gaze. "The one about the kids?" he asked. He had almost forgotten the story and the dream that followed. "Dan always has good stories, doesn't he?" "I guess." He paused before recalling his strange dream. "I had a nightmare." A look of wonder dawned on Susan's face. "You too?" Her attention was no longer on the stars. My uncle looked at her questioningly. "Are you messing with me?" "What?" "No, I had a nightmare, too. I woke up in a cold sweat and everything." Susan put her hands up defensively. Just then, Dan stepped out of his tent, his hair disheveled from sleep. The 2 stared at him as he rubbed his eyes. "You 2 are loud talkers, you know," he spoke with a yawn. "I think you're just a light sleeper," Susan said, rolling her eyes. Dan shrugged and sat in one of the fold-up chairs surrounding the now burned-out campfire. He looked up at the stars. "Man, would you look at that?" he smiled. "I was just saying the same thing," my uncle said. Sitting beside Dan, Susan stayed standing but looked up at the stars, too. The 3 stayed like that for a few minutes, enjoying the cold breeze that the night brought. Susan placed an arm on Dan's shoulder and yawned. "That story gave us nightmares," she smiled down at him. Dan seemed proud of himself and looked over at my uncle. "You too, Thomas?" My uncle only nodded, breaking his gaze from the stars to look at his feet. "Yeah, it was strange," he said. "We were walking up the trail to that cave, Susan, me, and Fred. I had that same dream." Susan cut in. "I was leading Thomas and Fred to some dark cave, and every time I tried to speak, thunder would drown out my voice." She explained her dream to them. My uncle's blood ran cold as he heard Susan explain the exact dream he had. It was the same, except he had led the two. My uncle looked back at the tents, at Fred's tent that he shared with his girlfriend, Amy. He could still hear Fred's gentle snoring. The boy was fast asleep, oblivious to everything. "Hey, what if we went to that cave?" Dan interjected. Susan and my uncle stared at him as if he were crazy. Dan only laughed as he urged the two to consider it at least. "I know where it is. We could go there in the morning." With a mischievous smile, he said, "Or we could go right now." My uncle swallowed and balanced his leg, not wanting to chicken out. He wanted to impress Susan. He had feelings for her all summer. Her auburn hair and light freckles that danced across her caramel skin. Her brown eyes with hints of gold always looked at him with humor whenever she would prompt adventure. It was her idea to go camping. "Let's go right now, before the others wake up," Susan agreed, and the two looked at my uncle expectantly. "Hi." "All right, fine. Let's be quick, though." He gave in and stood up. Susan passed Dan a lantern, and the three headed away from camp. The lantern and the moon gave them just enough light to see where they placed their feet as they hiked up what was slowly becoming a mountain to where Dan said the cave was. It was dark, but by the time they had reached a small clearing on the steep hill, the sun had begun to rise behind them. "Is it here?" asked Susan, not nearly out of breath as the other two. "Should be," answered Dan, raising the lantern as he spun around, surveying their surroundings. My uncle groaned in exhaustion. "Are you sure it's even real?" "I'm positive," Dan called back to him. The three looked around the small clearing before Dan called my uncle and Susan over to him. "I found it," he said triumphantly. As the two walked over to him, all they could see was foliage, but as Dan pushed back the leaves, they laid their eyes on the mouth of a dark cave. The entrance was only a couple of feet tall and extremely narrow, yet as the three peered inside, they could see it opened up into a vast cavern. "Should we, I don't know, go inside?" Dan asked cautiously. A gust of hot air was continuously coming from the cavern. The other two were silent as they shared glances of unease. My uncle was the first to respond, wanting to impress Susan with his bravery. "Let's go inside," he spoke, looking at Susan expectantly. "I'm sure it's fine." Sighing, Susan agreed, and soon the three of them ducked into the cave. Upon entering, the three were hit by a wall of foul-smelling, hot air. The inside of the cave was dark and seemed to swallow any light provided by the lantern. The three expected to see bats come flying out as they entered, like in the cartoons. Instead, all they saw was empty darkness. They dared not move as they surveyed the cavern, only then did they see they were standing on the edge of a steep drop-off. "Whoa," Susan remarked, staring at the pit. "Wouldn't want to fall down there," Dan joked, trying to make light of the situation. My uncle said nothing. He was practically transfixed by the inky darkness that threatened to spill over onto the edge he stood on. "It smells awful here," Dan spoke nasally as he pinched his nose. "Yeah, did something die?" Susan followed Dan's action. "It's the pit," my uncle said finally. "It's from my nightmare." Susan and Dan stared at my uncle as he stepped toward the darkness. They wanted to say something, grab him, and pull him back. Back and out of this cave, they felt they never should have entered. As Dan reached to pull him back, he caught a glimpse at exactly what my uncle was surrendering himself to. A monstrous thing of nightmares. Whether it was an animal or a being of divine creation, my uncle was not sure. But it called to him. It spoke to him incoherently, in a language long forgotten by time. It yearned for a feast, it yearned for him. My uncle internally screamed, but his body had long since abandoned him. He was a prisoner in his mind with a body that betrayed his every command. "Thomas!" Dan yanked my uncle by the arm back towards the cave entrance. No! The pit, the darkness! He shouted as he fought against Dan's attempt at a rescue. Tendrils of darkness pulled him closer to the pit. They were stronger than the two of them. Yet, in one last attempt to gain control over his body, my uncle decided the pit needed to be fed, or else it would not let the three go. "I'm sorry, Dan," he shouted over the voices from the pit and pulled Dan closer, yanking him to the edge before finally shoving the boy into the pit. As if like a switch, the voices stopped. The tendrils receded, and all that was left were my uncle and Susan. He looked around the cave and picked up the lantern, searching for Susan as he realized she was no longer in the cavern. "Susan?" He called out for her. He exited the cave's darkness and saw Susan huddled against a tree, staring at the mouth expectantly. The two said nothing to each other as they trekked down the mountain, sharing only glances and a silent agreement that what happened back there would never be spoken of. At least, that was until now. As I said, I cannot vouch for the events of this story. My uncle is an old, couch-hopping drunk who, although I love him, isn't known to be the most coherent man. I hope you all enjoyed this story. I know my uncle has many more that I may transcribe in the future. Hey Reddit, my name's Mark. I have a hobby for exploring old abandoned buildings around the US. I find most of the places I visit by talking to people on some forums and subreddits, but lately the pickings have been kind of dry. I've started visiting old ones through internet archives and stuff. A lot of the times these places have been torn down or rebuilt at this point, but sometimes you can find some pretty cool places that haven't been torn down yet. I found this weird post by someone with the username DastardlyDan from 2009 yesterday on an old urban exploration forum while messing around with the Wayback Machine earlier this week, though. People getting lost in these places isn't super uncommon, and generally others can come to their rescue or suggest resources to help, but police aren't always a great option considering in a lot of cases you are trespassing on private property. With this one though, there were no responses from others in the thread. Normally there'd be at least 1 or 2 responses, or a follow-up from the OP saying they got out. I tried to find this place myself and couldn't find anything that matched his description. I even tried following the directions on Google Maps and couldn't find it. I just can't get over it. Something about it messed with me. I figured you all would enjoy this, and maybe you can figure out where this place is. The thread itself is pretty long, taking place over the course of 3 days, so I'll be posting it in parts. I'd be interested to at least go see this factory. I don't think I'd go exploring there though. First post in the thread, July 8th, 2009. Hey everyone. Dan here. My buddies and I kind of got ourselves in a pickle here. I'm gonna try and give as much detail as I can. The signal's kind of shit, so I can't upload any pictures. It's a miracle I'm even able to post this. There's 3 of us and we're all from Florida. I typically am the one who finds the places. Jackson records our adventures on his camcorder, and Paul is just along for the ride most of the time. We went to go visit one of those old houses outside Fayetteville after someone here suggested it, and I made a post here about our trip the other day. Someone in the comments suggested an abandoned factory they had seen in the area. They said they hadn't explored there yet, and were waiting for the summer to be over, but gave us pretty clear directions on how to get there. They said to take US 401 on the way home and take a dirt road next to a pine tree alone in a field. They said there was no way we could miss it, and sure enough, we took US 401 back, and on one of those open stretches where there's nothing but woods and the road, on the right there was a single pine tree in a field with a dirt road beside it. Pull over, I think this it, I said to Paul from the back seat. As he pressed on the brakes and steered off to the side of the road, he looked uneasy. His dark eyes stared down the road as he said, Dan, what if this is just someone's house or something? Why would a factory be down a road like this? Then we turn around and head home. No harm, no foul, I said nonchalantly. I tied my long blonde hair back and started psyching myself up. I was really hoping this wasn't going to be that and that we hadn't been misled or something. Jackson, is the battery charged? Jackson rolled his eyes from the passenger seat. Yes, I charged it at the motel before coming here and haven't turned it on since we left. That's what you said before the mansions, but then it died 20 minutes in. He turned around and shot me a look. That was a one-time thing. You're the one who told me not to waste the money on an extra battery. My point stands. He flipped me the bird and turned back to the front. We sat in silence as Paul drove down the dirt road cut through the trees. The road was long. We'd probably been going down it for half an hour when Paul finally said, "Jesus, how long is this road? Maybe it's a nuclear power plant or something. That could be why it's so far away and in the middle of nowhere." Jackson turned to me. Wouldn't there be security or some kind of sign telling us to stay away or something? Even if it's abandoned. I shrugged. Maybe it's really old and they hadn't started doing that stuff yet. Jackson scoffed. I find that hard to believe. Jackson is a nice guy, all around. He's always thinks he's right, though. We've gotten into a ton of arguments over the dumbest shit, mostly because I just like to do it. Sometimes, though, his attitude gets on my nerves. It's like he's incapable of admitting his own mistakes. It's always someone else's fault with him. Finally, after another 20 minutes of driving, we saw clearing up ahead. It looked like once the road entered the clearing it taped off. I could see some tire tracks in the grass as we got closer. Once we entered the clearing, we could finally see the factory. There was one main building with 2 smokestacks on the left and a handful of buildings around it. Behind the main building, we could see a couple of short warehouses in the back. Paul drove up to the front of the main building and parked a few yards from the door. The windows were cracked and missing pieces of glass, and the bricks were overgrown with vines that sprouted from the dirt like massive hands dragging the building underground. Weirdly, there was no company branding or anything on the building. No sign out front or logo hinting at what was inside. I clapped and rubbed my hands together. You guys ready for this? Any uneasiness from before had faded from Paul's eyes, replaced with a bubbling excitement. As you guys know, the best part of exploring abandoned places like this is the moment right before you enter, when your mind is racing with possibilities of what you might find inside. Jackson had the camcorder out and was doing last-minute checks on the settings. I got all of our bags out and made sure we all had our walkie-talkies, flashlights, pocket knives, and first aid kits. You never knew where these places would lead or the environment you end up in. We exited the car, and I turned to Jackson. He had his camcorder up, and the red light was blinking. I waved to the camera and started practically skipping towards the door. Jackson stood back, filming the surroundings and capturing the field behind us. You could barely see the entrance to the dirt road from our angle. Paul walked behind me. We stood at the door, waiting for Jackson to join us. You come in? I called. One SEC. Jackson's camera was focused on an upstairs window. I walked over. What is it? I thought I saw something in the window. I punched his shoulder. Dude, it's probably just some crackhead or squatter. You know they hang out at these places all the time. He glanced at me and returned his gaze to the window. He sighed. You're probably right. Let's go. Paul called out. Dan, Jack, the door's locked. I grinned. So, we get to make our own? This just keeps getting better and better. I scanned the ground and found a fairly sizable rock, about the size of a baseball. I picked it up, dusted it off, and aimed for a window. It went straight through with a loud shatter that echoed inside the factory. I walked up to the window and knocked away the remaining glass shards. Looking inside, the place looked mostly gutted. There were steel pillars supporting the ceiling, but aside from a few pieces of general industrial junk like pieces of concrete, there was nothing else inside. I could see a doorway on the far wall, but couldn't really make out anything beyond that. I could smell rust in the stale air. I turned to the camera. "You guys ready?" Jackson nodded and smiled from behind the camera as I swung my leg over the ledge and stepped inside. Once inside, the smell intensified. The air itself smelled rotten and dead, more so than other places we had explored. I looked around the room. Just as I thought, it was totally empty. I shined a light at the doorway and could see shapes in the darkness. Jackson and Paul followed behind. Paul retched. "What is that smell?" "No idea." "I think I see the work floor up ahead through there though," I said, pointing at the doorway. "Let's go check it out," Jackson said, plowing forward with his camcorder in one hand and flashlight in the other. Our voices echoed in the large space, creating an eerie feedback loop that hung in the air. As Jackson approached the door, he paused, pointing the camera at a piece of concrete about the size of a basketball on the ground. "What the hell is that?" I walked up next to him and gasped. A bird lay underneath the concrete, smashed into a bloody smear of feathers and guts against the ground. One of its wings stuck out from beneath the rubble like an outstretched arm. This was fresh. I shined my flashlight into the dark doorway as Jackson remained frozen in place. Paul walked over and immediately gagged, turning away and grabbing onto a pillar as he held his stomach. Guess we found out what the smell was. "Poor guy's probably only been dead a couple days," I said, scanning the doorway for any sign of movement. There were no other entrances or exits to the room outside of this doorway and the locked door from before. And of course, our makeshift broken window door. Paul walked over, clearly upset. "Are you kidding? That thing looks like it's just been killed. That smell that's making you want to puke only starts after a day." "Decomposition takes time," I retorted. "What the hell could have done that?" "Not one of us could pick up that piece of concrete," Jackson said, finally breaking his gaze from the deceased animal. "Let's find out." I rolled up my sleeves and walked over to the piece of concrete. I grimaced and tried my best to grab the sides of the rubble without touching the body and got a decent grip on it. I tensed my muscles and tried to lift it to no avail. I stood back and dusted my hands off on my jeans. Probably just some junkie with crackhead strength. We should all be on our guard and keep it down low in case he's still around here. "Fuck this, I don't want to screw around with some junkie," Paul yelled. He was shaking. We hadn't bumped into people before, but knew it was always a risk. "Let's just go." I walked over to him and put my hand on his shoulder. "Paul, there are 3 of us, who all have knives. We're safe, okay? This is no different than all the other times we've been exploring. Remember the rat? About a year ago we were checking out an old treehouse in our town that had supposedly been abandoned. We walked inside and there were beer cans and cigarette butts all over the place. It was clear it had become some kind of hangout spot for the teens around. In a corner of the room, there was a piece of twine with a rat's body hanging from it. Paul had reacted similarly, freaking out thinking that some crazy person had done it, and I reminded him that it was probably just some kids doing a dumb prank. I didn't think this was some kind of prank though. That was part of the reason I tried to lift the concrete. To be honest, I was kind of nervous about the whole thing myself. It didn't make sense, even to me, for even a bum or something to do this, much less have the actual strength to lift something like that with enough force to be able to do the damage done to the bird. But I wanted to explore. I wanted to see more of this place, crackhead or not. So, I kept a calm demeanor and tried my best to calm Paul down. Besides, addicts are people to be afraid of. They're people, just like you and me. Thankfully, it worked. He seemed to relax a bit with this thought. I turned back to Jackson, who still had his camcorder out. Y'all ready to see the work floor? Let's find out what kind of factory this was, I said, flashing a smile. My friends reluctantly followed me, and God, I wish they hadn't. We traveled through the doorway and entered the massive work floor. It was hard to tell with the darkness and cluttered surroundings, but I'd say the room was about the size of a basketball court. I shone my flashlight on the dark shapes I had seen before. They were textile machines. There were dozens of them, aligned in tight rows. It was darker in here than the first room. There was only one row of windows on the left side of the room. It looked like there was an office or something in the back left corner of the room, separated from the machines. The floor was covered in rotten cotton and paper. What happened here? Jackson said, walking over to one of the machines with a crank on the side. He gently pushed it, and it made a sickening creak that echoed throughout the room. Isn't that the question we always ask? I joked. Jackson chuckled. I guess that's true. We walked among the machines. They were worn down by time. Some of them, like the scutching machine, I had to look that one up. It's what they used to purify the cotton, still had material in them, though it was rotted beyond belief. Some of it was growing mold that created a smell of decay in the air. There were doors at seemingly random points on the wall, but each was locked or stuck and wouldn't budge. Did anyone else notice how much colder it is in here? Paul said, rubbing his arms. I looked down at mine and saw goosebumps. It was weirdly chilly here, especially for North Carolina in July. Maybe it's some kind of draft that blows through here or something. Our steps echoed softly in the room as we silently all looked around and took it in. I began to make my way to the office I had seen in the back of the room. You guys ready to check out the office? Doesn't look like there's much more in this building, I asked. My friends nodded as they walked over to me. Jackson put his camcorder away, exchanging it for his pocket knife. The office had no windows, and the door was slightly ajar. With my friends behind me, I pulled out my knife and stood on the side of the hinges of the door. I pushed it open gently and waited a moment. I glanced back at my friends and stepped inside. It was pitch black in here. Without any windows, the only light came from the doorway. I shone my flashlight around the room. It was pretty simply furnished, with a wood desk and chair on the left side of the room, a bookshelf in the back left corner, and a filing cabinet on the right. The walls were beige and unadorned, aside from a clock beside the door. I walked over to the filing cabinet and pulled it open. It was full of manila folders full of paperwork packets and what I would assume to be company memos. I pulled one out and set it on the desk. I took off the rubber bands that were tying the documents together and opened it. It was some kind of employee handbook or something. The company listed on the front was Devorder Textiles. Weird-ass name, I muttered under my breath as I began flipping through the document. Hey, check this out. I think there's something behind the bookshelf, Jackson said. I turned my head up to him. Look. He pointed to a sliver of dark wood that peeked out from behind the bookshelf. It stood in stark contrast to the light beige of the walls. Paul walked over. Let's move the bookshelf. I nodded in agreement and walked over. I stood on the edge closest to the wall while Paul and Jackson pulled on it from the other side. The bookshelf creaked as it began to tip over. Shit, 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 shit. I yelled, running to the other side in a desperate attempt to keep it from falling. It tipped over on its face with a deafening crash. So much for staying quiet, I sneered, looking down at the bookshelf. Holy shit, Paul whispered softly. I turned my head up to see what the bookshelf had revealed. It was a door. "Dude, this is sick," Jackson exclaimed, grabbing his camcorder out of his bag. A deep feeling of dread began to set in. It was like a primal part of my brain knew something was wrong about that door. We should have turned back. But that adventurous spirit in me reared its head and spat in the face of my doubts. I had to go forward. I was an explorer. "Let's see where this goes," I announced, reaching tentatively for the handle. It was like every instinct I had was telling me to not touch that doorknob, but I did it anyways. I grasped it gently and slowly turned it. The door opened with a creak and revealed a staircase descending down. Jackson laughed. "Dude, this is nuts. We gotta post this to YouTube or something when we get out of here." He stepped into the doorway with his camcorder and flashlight in hand, descending the stairs rapidly. Paul followed behind him, and I brought up the rear. As I stepped in the doorway, something told me to make sure that door didn't close. I stepped back into the office and pushed the bookshelf slightly into the doorway, propping the door open. I then raced down the steps to catch up with my friends in the growing darkness. It's funny, when you're in a pitch-black room, you can't imagine that it could possibly be darker. As we descended the steps and got further and further away from the doorway, though, it did just that. It was as if the darkness was growing in intensity. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me or something, but I could have sworn that our flashlights were getting dimmer and the air was getting colder, almost icy, with every step we took. My mind wandered back to the bird corpse we had found maybe an hour prior to this. Maybe the killer was lurking down here in the shadows. After walking down these steps for a few moments, it was like the cold had reached a threshold of some kind. My teeth were chattering. "I can see the end up ahead." "Almost there," Jackson called out. I looked over his shoulder. I could see a small rectangle of light ahead of him. We pressed on and found ourselves in some kind of cellar. There were crates lining the walls. The light came from an oil lantern hanging from the ceiling. I switched off my flashlight and walked over to the lantern. "Shouldn't this be out?" I asked aloud. Jackson and Paul had begun inspecting the crates. In comparison to what we had seen above, these were all in good shape. They looked old and weathered, sure, but the structural integrity of the container was still intact. They were chattering to each other, attempting to figure out how to open one of them when Paul looked up at me. "I don't know about you, but all that darkness was getting to me. There's light down here, and I'm not going to argue about whether or not it should be. I'm just happy we can see our own hands without a flashlight." I looked around the room. There was another door. Loud thumps behind me snatched my attention. I turned around to see Paul repeatedly kicking a crate trying to open it, while Jackson filmed it. "Hey, if you two knuckleheads are done screwing around, I'm pretty sure there's more to this basement." They stopped their assault of the crate to look at me, and then noticed the door. "Oh shit, the mystery deepens," Jackson said, turning the camcorder to the door. "Shall we continue on our journey?" Paul came up beside him and nudged him. "I think we have to." Paul stepped in front and opened the door. He stepped inside and we followed behind him. We found ourselves in a duplicate version of the office above, except this time there were two strange paintings on the wall behind the desk. I walked over to get a better look as Jackson began to inspect the bookshelf and Paul walked over the filing cabinet. The two paintings were in gold frames, displaying scenes that looked mundane until closer inspection. One showed peaceful countryside with a bridge over a creek. Beside the bridge there was an oak tree. It looked innocent enough until you noticed that the shadow of the oak tree depicted someone hanging. The other painting showed a scene from a party that looked like a scene straight out of The Great Gatsby. However, each guest's face was contorted with pain or fear, rather than joy and merriment. The dancing looked more like panicked flailing. "What the fuck?" Jackson screamed from the other room. I ripped my gaze from the strange paintings and sprinted through the doorway, Paul following closely behind me. When I got to Jackson and looked around, my stomach dropped. This was not the same room we were just in. The entry hallway was gone. We were now back on the work floor, except everything was in perfect condition. The windows were no longer cracked, and the machines were neat and in order. I sprinted back into the office. It had changed too. The wallpaper was peeling and the smell of mold filled the air. The file cabinet was thrown open and the papers were scattered everywhere. What the fuck happened? I muttered. Jackson and Paul began to enter the office. Suddenly something clicked into place. I screamed, "Stop," and walked over to them, out of the office. I shut the door behind me and opened it. Sure enough, it was now more decrepit, except the files were all back in the cabinet. Each time we change rooms, it's taking us deeper. We shouldn't have left the first room. We need to stay here, I explained, closing the door again. I pulled out my cell phone. I still had a signal, thank God. I opened up the forum page and logged in. I'm gonna make a SOS post on the forum. We need to wait for someone else to come get us. Who the fuck made you the leader? You're the reason we're stuck down here in the first place. Paul suddenly screamed, lunging towards me. Jackson caught him. Hey, chill the hell out. We don't know what the fuck is going on, but it's not gonna help if we're fighting. He fucking got us in some trippy ass Twin Peaks type shit. Fuck this. Why should we stay here? We can walk outside, he exclaimed, at the end pointing at one of the shipment gates that was cracked open. I paused. We don't know what's out there. Jackson released Paul, and he seemed to shake off the rage. He still glared at me and stared at Jackson as he stepped in front of me. Now, hold on. That isn't a bad idea. It looks like it just goes outside. I looked at him like he was stupid. Okay, let's be real for a second. We went who knows how many stories underground. We found one room, entered another one from that, and the first room is now gone, replaced with a duplicate copy of a room upstairs. How the hell could we possibly have gotten to ground level? Jackson shrugged. It makes sense to me. No, it doesn't, I spat. Do whatever you guys want. I'm gonna get writing this post while I still have a battery. I turned away and focused on my phone. I heard them pause and mutter something to each other for a moment, and their footsteps slowly grew softer on the concrete floor. I heard a metallic groan as they opened the door. I scoffed. A couple minutes later, I heard screaming. I was almost done with the post. I bolted outside to find Paul on the ground, some 20 feet away from Jackson, who was close to the door. Paul was convulsing on the ground, in agony. He was the one screaming. I began to step forward and Jackson shot his arm out, unable to tear his eyes from Paul as he writhed in agony. Someone, please. Someone help me. I pushed Jackson's arm down. What the fuck? Why aren't you helping him? Jackson pointed to a small line of dirt around 4 feet from Paul. It started when he crossed that line. What do you mean? He stepped over that line, made it about 3 steps and collapsed. Blood was now coming out of Paul's eyes and ears as he shook. He was no longer screaming. Suddenly, he stopped. He coughed, and a splurt of blood shot out of his mouth and turned to froth on his lips. And then his chest stopped moving. Paul's fucking dead.